Okay, so just confirm you guys hear me again. I can't. Can anyone talk out loud?
Yeah, can you
Oh,
hear
we can
us?
hear you.
I can hear you. Okay,
Yes.
cool. Cool. So I wanted to show you this diagram first, which you can now see. Which I just quickly made an Excala draw because it sets the stage for what HTML is. So we're going to get into backend next week, and backend and front end have to backend and front end. What they are is this thing that we call the server model, the basic server model, and it has two parts to it. It has the client and the server. If you're on a web browser, if you're on Chrome, Safari, whatever it is, and you're browsing the web, going to different pages, you are the client. The server is the person who owns the website, and they're going to be running some kind of software. In our case, it'll be Django when it's our server. The server is there to respond to requests from clients. And so you on your web page, when you type myspace.com into the URL bar and you hit enter, you're sending a request over the internet, and it's kind of complicated how it finds the right server, but it eventually finds the server that owns myspace.com, and they hear your request. Oh, you want to go to the homepage. Okay. So it's going to translate that URL to a specific resource. And that resource is going to be myspace-homepage.html, which is just a file that lives on their computer. And then they send it over to you, the client. So it's sort of like you, the person typing here, make a request, they get it, and then they create or otherwise, find this file called something.html, and they send it over to you, the client. And then at that point, once they send it over, it's done. As in, at that point, the conversation is completely over. The client has the HTML file, and now it's the client's computer's job to use its web browser to take an HTML page and turn that into an image, essentially. And websites are a little more complicated now. Like a website like Facebook, it's hard to really comprehend how it's all one image, or you're just seeing an image on the screen at any given time. But that's what a web page is fundamentally. It gets more complicated eventually because we add in JavaScript, but in its most basic form, an HTML page, it just represents essentially a poster. It's a 2D poster, and it'll have things like MySpace rocks, or it'll have a little, image of somebody. And then, it'll have some paragraphs of writing, because you can do that, and you can make it as, maybe you want your website to be a little better. You put in some kind of header with your logo and navigation, and then you put in some kind of footer. This is what an HTML page is in its most essential form. It's just a poster. And what we're going to learn about today is HTML and CSS, which are the two of the three components that make up a given HTML page. So an HTML page has three. An HTML page is obviously HTML, but it has three essential components to it. It has HTML, which represents sort of the core structure of the page and its content. It has CSS, which represents the style. So there's a million fonts you could possibly choose, a million colors you could possibly choose. A poster is not just its content, right? It's how it's arranged in 2D, and you might want to get very specific about how you do that for design purposes, and that's what CSS is, the design layer. And then finally, there's JavaScript. And JavaScript is something we have learned up until now to some degree, but essentially it's your Python on the front end. It's a full-on programming language. And that's an important point about these two, where we're going to go to look at HTML for a second. But before going on, how about let's look at these two images. How do people feel about the client server model. You don't have to understand the whole thing, but just does it make sense that someone is requesting a web page and then it's sent back, and once it's sent back, that's the end of the transaction. The server can no longer fix anything, or if it doesn't, like, basically that's the end of the communication, at least in the basic server model. All right. I'm going to guess we're okay, but we gotta find a way collectively to get feedback, because I don't know if I lose you guys sometimes, and it's okay to not know this stuff, and we can ask questions. But if everyone feels good, the thumbs up, that's good. I like that. Okay, yeah. So we have this page that is represented by HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's create this page. If I go here, I could create the page. Importantly, I just want to show you that, to prove the point, kind of, if I go to myspace.com, in your browser, you have this thing where you can right click and hit inspect. Alternatively, you can hit F12, and that'll open this thing called the developer console. And it represents everything your browser knows about that page because it's rendered it and it has it, of course. But as you see, we have HTML, right? That's all this is. This whole thing is one big HTML tag with a lot of content. And when we get into the content, we can see, like, I can use this button right here, which will highlight a given element in the HTML. So I can click on this picture of Tom York, who I love, and it's going to show me, oh, this specific div. Let's make this a little bigger so you can see it. Can I make this bigger? Yeah, so this specific div right here, and we'll get into what a div is, this represents Tom York on the page. And all websites, even complicated ones that are changing in real time as if they're apps, they're still using this canvas that is HTML. And then you'll see we have CSS here on the side. So CSS is something that you will add to your HTML. And it defines how visual things behave. So if I look at this image, where was it again? Or maybe even better, like this image. Okay. I'm just grabbing this whole article, right? And it has some CSS on it, and I could just say background color. Okay, what if it was red? And that's part of the benefit of a developer console, that you can just in real time say, like, oh yeah, what might look good here? And then I would say height. Oh, that's not enough height. Let me that doesn't seem to be affecting anything, which you'll actually see fairly often. It can get confusing. Delete it. You can delete things in real time, but you'll see that there's all these CSS things that if I start changing values, look, the website goes crazy, right? It doesn't understand if that is now some random value, position unset. And so CSS is all of these individual key value pairs where the key represents some visual quality and the value is what it's set to. And then finally, there's JavaScript, where you can see right here, we have console. If I click there, I can see I can't really see the JavaScript that was ran, but I see the output console. And it's showing me that, they're doing things in these various files, and code is running in real time. So JavaScript is that final code layer. You'll notice if I can click on a link here that theoretically should take me to the source code, right? And then I could actually see the JavaScript running. But notice at the end here, first there's the ominous, or the ominous alphanumeric random thing, but then it has .min at the end, right? .min stands for minify. It's JavaScript speak for, we made this hard to read because we don't want strangers reading it. So if you click it, it's still good JavaScript code, but it's hard to read. Every variable is replaced with A, B, or C or something like that. And as a result, it's hard to read what this code actually does. But that is all to say that, closing JavaScript for a second, that's all an HTML page is. It's three things: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And you can actually just create an HTML file on your computer and you don't have to send it through a server. You can just open it up on in your own browser, and you can see HTML, CSS, JavaScript working. So I'm going to create a new HTML file. What am I going to call this? Robocop fan page.html. Let me save that somewhere. We'll just go source. Cool. So if I want to create an HTML page, the first thing I do is it's just a document. First, let's mention that it's just a document. So like anything else that is a document, it's just made of characters. And in HTML, we write these things called tags, which contain each other. So the first tag you have on the outside is HTML. It represents the whole thing. And then the next two you'll generally see are, what is it? It's not header, is it? Yeah, it's header. Okay. Header represents, it can get a little confusing. It's not the header. It's not like a header to a website. So if we go back to MySpace, it's not, if we go back to MySpace, you might think that the header means like this area, right? Or maybe even this area, like the sidebar, but this might be the header, right? Not in HTML. In HTML, when we say header, we're saying this is all the stuff that you're not going to see, but that maybe is important. So you could have something like what they call like a meta tag. Oh, it's not giving me any examples. What's a good? It's basically how you might grab a resource. So if you would say like, I think link is what I want. Like if we were going to reference some CSS that was somewhere else, we would put it in here. We might just put our CSS in here raw. This is how you would put in CSS, but we'll get to that in a second. First, next to the header is what is going to be called the body. The body is what's actually seen. And that's how you start building a website. So once you're within the body, you have certain tags, and those tags have meaning in terms of essentially the content or structure of a page. So most basic one, in my opinion, is if you're going to have a poster of some kind, you want a heading, right? There's one word or set of words you want to pop out more than anything else. So our heading will be MySpace, just MySpace. And that is a complete website as far as I'm concerned. So now let's open it. Let me go, oops. Still getting used to the controls on here. Right, let's go into our Finder. And I should have a, where did I just put everything? Is it in Documents? No. Desktop? Nope. Give me a second. Source, there we go. Robocop fan page, right, I forgot, it's not about MySpace. So we got to make an edit. Let's start doing these side by side. Let's see, I have my HTML there and I have my website here. And this is how you would generally do it. You kind of have them right next to each other. So as you see, it's just pointing to the file on my computer. And I realized I made a mistake, so I want to edit it. This is actually Robocop, just Robocop. We'll just say Robocop, right? And I can reload this. You do have to reload. What's wrong? Why is it not? Oh, I didn't save it. There we go. So we see Robocop. And fundamentally, this is what a website is. So we should stop here to find out if this makes sense. This is all a website is before we add anything to it. It's just a image that can display in 2D and these keywords like H1, which will give you some automatic styling. You know, paragraph. So how do we feel about HTML?
Good.
Seems
Good.
easy
Okay.
enough.
Yeah, so HTML is hopefully not too confusing. What I just did here, by the way, is a trick you can use. If you ever want a whole paragraph and you're in VS Code, you just start typing lorem, L-O-R-E-M. And there's this famous Latin sentence that typesetters have used for like centuries or something. And it's just, it just gives you a little bit of content so that now you can test out your website with maybe some content and you didn't have to think of real content. And it's suddenly saying, all right, maybe you want me to translate that to from Latin. Cool. So I have this website and I have these tags. So I might want to keep adding to this, and I feel like we have text so far. The next obvious thing you might want is an image, right? So that happens to be another tag. Image, notably, is a self-closing tag. So I'll write, I believe that's how you write it. So what do I mean by that? Well, normally our tags have this structure of open left bracket, then the name of the tag, in this case, H1, like header 1, because there's other headers like header 2. And then Visual Studio is helping me, but immediately when I close that tag, it gives me the closing tag. And the closing tag looks the same as the opener tag, but after the opening bracket, it has a slash. So this is just how we contain things in HTML, because sometimes something contains something else. So HTML or our H2 element can contain some text content, but not everything is going to have text content. For example, an image. So an image, we just write image and we close it immediately. And then I'll save it and reload. And you might see we have no image. Well, that might make sense. Maybe it doesn't. If we look in here, we'll see we do have an image. We have an image taking up 0 space. So why is it taking up 0 space? Well, an image needs content too, but it's going to get its content a little differently. So this is our first example of an HTML attribute. This is the tag, and the tag can have one or more attributes. So in the case of an image, and you'll see Visual Studio is being nice for auto-completing, but it'll actually tell me like, oh, this is what an HTML image supports in terms of its attributes. One thing is source. And then from source, I can give it an actual image, which by default is generally going to be a URL. So this URL might eventually live on your own computer, or you could save it to your computer if you really wanted to. But basically, I can go grab a picture of what's his name, of RoboCop, and you'll notice they make it a little hard to steal their URL because they know you can do this. But usually, how do I get just the image? Yeah, there we go. So copy image address. I can put that in here. And that is a very long, weird address, but that should work. That is where that image lives. And now if I reload my page, I have an image of RoboCop. Awesome. So I have, it says RoboCop. We got some text. I have a gigantic image of RoboCop. Maybe I want to take this out. And I want to make sure you guys can see because it's cutting it off a little bit. Every tag here is closed, so I'm gonna wrap this so you can see that. Yeah, so HTML just involves these tags that can be nested in each other, and sometimes they have attributes, and I might have even more attributes here like height. I think that should work. Width, no, actually, wait. You could often hover over and it'll tell you, but I don't know if I can tell it pixels or not. I'm just going to say width equals 120, height equals 120. And let's reload the page. And now my image is more reasonable. That almost seems too small. Okay, cool. So what haven't we discussed yet in HTML? Or the next two things that make sense to talk about are CSS and JavaScript, just to understand how they fit in. But before doing that, how do we feel about basic HTML? You have, tags within tags and they represent something. I like the thumbs up. Thank you.
I've got a quick question.
Yeah.
So we're able to view the HTML of other websites.
Yes.
If you wanted to essentially just copy someone's format instead of creating your own, is that what people do? is just
Sort of,
copy a
yeah.
format that they like and then edit the
Um,
items?
yeah, so that's a good question. In general, if I look at the dev console, I can definitely steal all the HTML. But more, that's going to be very specific to this site. So more valuable, maybe I would want to click sources and say, okay, well, I mean, basically I want to know where their CSS and HTML is. Looks like it's not separate. Basically, people make it difficult. It's not impossible. It's there to steal. But basically, there's these various processes like minification, for example, where you can make a resource that is yours that you want protected in some way, obfuscated, such that it's going to take someone a lot of effort to learn it from you. At the same time, though, there are many sites like Twitter, most famously, who they have such a popular style sheet that people want to steal that they just released it as a project. So there's this project called Bootstrap, which we learn eventually in this course, which is basically just CSS according to Twitter, and they give you their style sheet for free. And then of course try and like sell you on unique things. But at its core, CSS and JavaScript are both there and you can steal them. It's just gonna be hard to read it.
Got it.
Yeah, but it's kind of fun. There's kind of a whole industry of reverse engineering a website and saying like, how did they do it? We want to do it. And you have the engine in front of you basically, so you can reverse engineer it. Cool. Any other questions along the lines of just basic structure HTML, anything we've covered so far?
Yes. So you put your H1 element within the body.
Mm-hmm.
Is that your own preference? Because it almost makes sense to put it like in the header because it's a heading.
Yeah, yeah.
Or
well, that was the thing I was trying to cover. So basically, when
okay.
you're thinking of a header, you're thinking of like nav bar, nav. Okay. So, and again, notice that if I just like, I can start putting things in the nav bar, like I don't even remember how, like I could just say unordered list, list item, home, and then contact. How about that, right? So when you were saying, when you're talking about header, you're thinking of something like this, right? I mean, this is a terrible version of it, but something where it's like the name of the company and then some important things to click, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, that's totally reasonable. That happens to not be what header means in an HTML doc. Rather, header is what is essentially meant for the computer, not for the person viewing it. So what is something, it's a great time to introduce CSS basically, because one thing you might want to do in here is write your CSS, because your user is never going to view the CSS, right? But you can put tags in there that you're basically, the reason for it is that let's say you do have some CSS or JavaScript, whatever it is, you can have that all in the header, and basically that runs first. And then the page that starts at body is only rendered once there's like all the data you care about is available or something like that. It's not that simple, but basically I could define my CSS anywhere. So if I define my CSS down here, like after the body, or not, I don't think I can. Yeah, I believe, can I do after the body? Can I just do style? I can just write CSS here. So I think style, I can say, okay, let me grab all H1s. You don't need we don't expect you to know CSS yet, but this is how you might write it. I say, grab all the CS1s and then give them a color, which means the font color of red. So let me put my style tag there, and then I reload and it worked, right? This is kind of hard to see on a small site, but imagine you had a really big site. The whole site might load. You've probably seen this on some sites. The whole site loads, and then after a second or two, the fonts load in, and then you see kind of a jump where like it looked bad and now it looks okay. Or alternatively, you've gone to a site and it looks like terribly, and it's because the content is there, but their CSS failed to load. But basically, header is where you might put stuff that you want to run before the rest of the page runs. So in this case, oh, I lost it. But in this case, I could put a style tag. If I had it locally, I would call it a link tag. Is link tag self-closing? I think so. Link tag, I would say something like, I think it's source, no, href, yeah. And I might say something like, oh, get my CSS from, you know, this website or something like that. So yeah, that was kind of long-winded, but does that explain what the header tag is about?
Yeah, so it's like, I think that's what's considered metadata.
Right, exactly. So there's a
Okay.
specific tag called meta, which is exactly for this. So there's ways like metadata would be something the person reading your website might care about for like finding out like keywords or something. So that's the basic way that Google knows anything is that someone can write in their header like, I think, you know, I forget the exact syntax, but you can write something like meta, you know, keywords equals A, B, C. There's ways to like just write information about your website that other people can then pick up, and it's not viewed by the person. All right, well, I should probably show you that link thing first, because I do want you to understand what it's like for this afternoon if you're writing a website where you are referencing something on your actual computer. So let me actually try and save this image. And let me save it to the same file where I have my website, because that's usually the easiest thing to do. So I have it right there. Maybe I should make a new folder called RoboCop and put them both in there. Cool. So in here, I'm going to save this image, which I'm going to call RoboCop. Yeah, and we'll see what format it is when I save it. WebP, okay. And then I'm going to go to where my website is and drag that in here. And I'll open that once again because the other one will now have a bad URL, and then I'll have to open this again because it doesn't know about it anymore. Let's just open it from the file system. Can I just open that in VS Code really easily? No, maybe not. What? Really? I hear some sound, but is someone trying to talk? No, nobody's trying to talk. All right. Oh, sorry about that, guys. Just taking me a second here. Geez, you know what? This is fine. RoboCop page. Okay, so we're in our RoboCop page, and maybe I have a file in there. So my HTML would often be at the top, and just so we get used to the habit, I'm gonna call this. How do I rename? I'm gonna call this not RoboCop webpage.html, but index.html. Index.html is just this standard name you give to the main page you want to open, and everyone knows that's what you mean when you call it index.html. It means start here. And then I'm going to create a folder, which I'm going to call, I want to make sure my folder is within RoboCop page. The folder is going to be called resources. That's pretty common. You just put everything in resources. So we're going to move it in there. And then from here, I can say something like, instead of the source of the image being something far away, I think I can just say slash resources. It doesn't seem to think that's true, but if I say slash resources, it's not auto-completing, which, can make you scared, but
I think if you
robocop.
start it with a period and then a slash.
Yeah. And then it knows where we are. So like, as in we're in index.html. Yeah, good point. Let me see what it, I think the reason why I wasn't listening to what it said is because it seemed to me confused because of what folder I opened. And I don't know that HTML is going to respect this. I think it might need the full URL, to be honest. So this is me assuming where I seem to think the website lives, and let's see if it works.
It looked like VS Code wanted you to start with the Robocop page folder first and then resources.
Yeah, it looks like you are right, as in it seems to be auto-completing for me, but thinks slash means Robocop page. And where am I? I thought I was in Robocop page. Let me look at that again. Robocop. Oh no, that is right. Yes. So why your file couldn't be accessed? What's going wrong here? Source Robocop page, Robocop. Oh, right, because I'm looking at index.html now. Well, that's my own. Let's see what happens now. Okay, it isn't seeing the image. Good point. And so based on what you were saying and what we see here, it looks like it thinks I'm starting at Robocop page, right? Is that what you were saying?
No, when you were just typing resources, as soon as you put the slash, autocomplete came up suggesting to write Robocop page,
Right.
not resources. So if you.
Okay, so if I just do the slash, you're saying, right? It's saying Robocop page. So let's see if that works first. Because if it is auto-completing, it usually means something. It can be wrong, but I could be wrong too. And that there's a high possibility that it's still not working. Okay, so
Okay, I know what
let's
the issue is.
okay, yeah.
Can I walk you through it?
Yeah.
If you go to the VS Code, you want to so delete the whole string that you have in the source.
Yeah.
And then start out with ... and then slash. And then go to okay, so you're in Robocop page, and then yeah.
I
And
think
then
you're
it
right.
should
This
work.
will work because this is what we would call a relative reference. Great, awesome, great. Yeah, so the reason why that worked, the relative path, has a lot to do just with the fact that I'm on a computer and I'm not using URLs, which we would normally do if it was being served up on a website. So you don't end up thinking about that import path thing too often in HTML, but it is referenced to somewhere in your, or like you can. Okay, so this is my HTML page. The whole point of this was to show you that I can now reference resources that are on my computer. So one thing I might want to do is create a new resource called style.css. People often just call it style if you just have one. The idea is this is going to represent the main CSS file for my whole page, and my page is going to be small. So I can write some basic CSS, and this is how you do that. Notice CSS is a different language from HTML. It doesn't follow any of the same rules, but much like HTML, it's what we would call a markup language. So JavaScript is a full programming language because it can do two things. It can represent data in the form of saying like X equals 1. And then 2, it can perform computations, perform operations. So you could add something to 1 and save it back in the same variable, or you could print 1. HTML and CSS are different. They're not programming languages. They're a level lower, which is what's called a markup language. And what makes something a markup language is you can only use it to represent data. There's no way to represent computation. So you may have noticed that already in index.html that it is a poster because you can't, it doesn't do anything. It just is a representation of what the website looks like, but in a code-like way that is very specific and defined. So same with CSS, where I can pull it over here. And the way CSS works is that you have selectors, and selectors target a specific element. The simplest type of selector is a tag itself. So I could say something like, do I still have my H1 in there? Yes. So I could say something like H1, and that will select RoboCop, or it'll select anything that is an H1 tag. And notice I said anything because if I were to have two, for some reason, if I were to have two H1s, that would RoboCop part 2. This selector would grab both of them. It wouldn't just affect one, it wouldn't just affect the first or the last. Selectors grab as many things as they can that match that selector. And eventually we will get into how selectors allow you to be very specific, but you have to learn this like language of selectors. But anyway, I could select for H1 and then say all H1s have a color, right? And this is probably the hardest part about CSS. You see when I wrote color, look how many things have the word color in it in CSS. CSS is just a list of these key value pairs, and there's no way of really learning what they do except by reading them. And so we see here, color sets the color of an element's text. You might not have guessed that. You might thought it would be the whole element, like, you know, the box around it, but no, that would be background color. This is color, and so we'll say red. We want this, and notice I didn't use quotes or anything. When you write CSS, your key is just you know, written out like a word, like it is in JavaScript object keys. And then the value is not a string. The value is one of a number of values that are accepted by CSS. So in this case, red is an accepted one. And so here I have background color. And notice that while I do have these options, you see on the right here how I can see, oh, something called crimson has this little code next to it. Well, that is cool because I can actually write that little code. And that little code is a way of telling what a color is. And I always forget how it's done, but it's the letters A, B, C, D, E, and the numbers 0 to 1, right? Can anyone confirm for me like this? Yeah, you'll see it's starting to build the color while I write it. Why is four letters enough for that seems too small. Oh, I suppose it's 4 letters. Okay, so it's 4 letters that represent wait, can I? No. It's 4 letters. I think it can be, there are 2 more that represent the color essentially. It's a little too much to go into why that is, but you'll see these hex colors a lot because they're a way of getting as specific as you want about what a color looks like. So a designer can make a design in Photoshop and then she can select that an element and say, oh, it has exactly this color according to the hex. Cool, but this is my style.css. And if I want it to run on this page, I need to pull it in somehow. So you'll see I have this style tag down here. That's the way to do it, what we would call inline. But we don't want to do it inline. Rather, we want to reference it in a file because we know it's going to grow. So the way we do that in HTML is this tag called link. And it looks like link is a self-closing tag. And in there, I have href. When you don't see source, you often see href. Href, I still don't really remember or know what it stands for, but the ref is like reference. So it takes a URL. And in this case, my URL is not going to be a URL exactly. It's going to be a file path, but it's worth seeing how those are the same thing. As in a URL starts with HTTP, some kind of website, which is telling it kind of where to go. But then it ends in a file path because it is a way of locating files. That's what URL is. It stands for Universal Resource Locator. It's just a system by which you can find a given file. So on our file system, we're going to look for Robocop page resources. Well, I don't want that. I actually want style.css, and it knows about it, which is a good sign. And then I'm going to go back here and reload it. And interesting, why
I think you changed the wrong
I
source.
changed something incorrectly. Let's see. It does get confusing when the page is a little small. So I see I put it in the image. That's going to break the image. Good catch, right? So it's here that I want to say .. Robocop page resources style. Great. This is why pair programming is useful, that it's really easy to miss things on your own.
Can I tell you another thing?
Oh yeah, there's another. Okay.
The header is actually head. The tag.
Thank you so much. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. I need to look up my HTML fundamentals.
I get it confused too.
It's easy to get certain tags confused because there's too many of them and it doesn't really warn you about it, but that's right. And that is why actually, to whoever said it before, header would be appropriate here. Head would not be appropriate here, but header would, because it represents the header of the page. So I apologize for getting that wrong. But yeah, something to notice is that you might be asking yourself, why are there all of these HTML element types? They all look about the same, right? And also, the look, it only gives you a default look. CSS controls the rest of the look. So why have so many HTML element types? The answer is because it more deeply than the image, it represents the structure of your page. And importantly, if someone is on a screen reader or is otherwise disabled such that they're reading your page in a way that is not primarily visual and 2D, the HTML is going to tell them a lot more about what's on your page than the visual image. So it's the reason why you have things like header, because even though header might not, it's only a way of organizing something to you. If someone is using this on a screen reader, they can actually say, jump to the header and then read me everything that's in the header. And if you set it up nicely, that works well for them. If you don't, it works poorly. Yeah, but that is there's very many of these tags, and part of the assignment today is just learning a bunch of the tags, although tags don't matter that much. Tags just give you a default style, and then you can modify that style as much as you want. Okay, so what time is it right now? I see we've gone for 50 minutes, which I think is a fair amount. I think we've covered a fair amount. I haven't used the main document or the main teaching document because I wanted to make sure we just sort of saw it first before getting into like work concepts, what we call things like that. But now that we've seen it, we're going to take a break and then come back and talk a little bit more specifically about HTML and CSS. And I think what I want to start doing, I need to speak to Zainab about this, but you guys and the instructors both agree that lectures in the morning can be too long. And you guys seem to enjoy when we broke up the lectures Friday. So what I think would be nice is we start normally around like 9, and then we go 50 minutes like we just did. And then we'll give you a 10-minute break, and then we'll go another 50 minutes and give you another 10-minute break. Or actually, maybe there's no break. We just go straight into lunch. Okay, how about this? 50 minutes, then a 20-minute break, then another 50 minutes, and then lunch. And then if we need to do an extra hour, we do it in the afternoon before assignments. Does that sound pretty good? Okay, so that's the plan right now. Take a 20-minute break now.
Ben, before you
Yeah.
go on break too, can you pull up your the image file, I guess, what you're referencing here in this image?
Sure.
What does that file look like?
So you're saying if this?
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering how you saved, did you save the image to your resources? I was following you when you put the link in to reference it.
Okay. So I
But then when
saved
you-
this on my computer. Yeah,
Okay, and you just put it in your resources folder. Got it.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Either way, it's just it's a file path. It's just a URL is generally a file path that starts on someone else's computer.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So see y'all in 20 minutes.
Okay. So where did we leave off? We were going through this HTML page and seeing what it looks like when we render it. And I read some comments in the chat over the break, and two things were good comments. Not that they all weren't, but one of them importantly was about this thing called live server. Dave, that's a really good suggestion. Live server is an extension that you can get on Visual Studio, and it makes it so it, in a very lightweight way, you just get to serve up the page from a server, and that makes everything operate like it really would. And that's important because so you'll see up here I have this weird number, which is representing my computer as the you know, this web browser is the client, and even though it's talking to something on the very same computer, it's doing it over the internet. So this is my identity as a server, and then I'm just grabbing that first thing I see, and this should work too, in that I don't even have to say index.html. That's why you write index.html, because that's what root is now. But notice also my CSS and images are loading. And if I go back to how I defined it, you'll see here we write about how now that we're serving it, we can do our URLs more basically the normal way, in which instead of doing them with relative paths, I instead start all of them with slash, and slash represents where my server is, and my server is being served from this file. As you see, I have live server on, so all I had to do is say, you know, open up live server, and it opens that page. But it's serving all of this folder, so I just say slash to represent the folder I am in, and slash resources, and then the actual resource, and it works. So yeah, live server is a great thing to use for testing this stuff out, including your assignment this afternoon, because that's the actual environment. And if you have any trouble setting it up, let us know early on and we can help you get set up with it. Okay. Oh, and then there was a second note about semantic HTML. So I think that's a good point. We're about to get into the lecture content. But before we do that, I am just going to say basically, semantic HTML is a term that means it represents what the content is. And there's a lot of them at this point. So there's ones like article, for example. And the idea is you can wrap an article in that, and then anyone who just has the HTML but hasn't rendered your page can pretty easily know whatever's inside of there represents an article on your page. To that point, as I see it, there's only really 3 kinds of HTML tags. There's structural tags, which are sort of, you have to have them or else it's not a valid HTML page. Things like HTML, head, and body. And then there's div and span, which we haven't covered yet, but we will. And div and span are kind of like, they're very plain, but they represent the building blocks of all other elements. A div is essentially a block that takes up the whole screen, and a span, a block that takes up just part of the screen. So if I look in here, we would call this image, because it's only taking up part of the screen, that's an example of a span. Whereas if we look at the H1, you'll notice that H1 stretches to the end of the screen. You can't put another thing next to it. That's a div. And those are the 2 building blocks where if you ever want to do something visually, putting things next to each other, you use div and span, and everything else is ultimately made out of that. So yeah. And then finally there's H1, bold, emphasis, but article would be there too. These are semantic tags, which they mean something to someone who is reading the HTML page and can't necessarily see it visually. So that is that includes handicapped people, but it also includes screen readers, which are not screen readers. Sorry, it also includes web crawlers, which is kind of an important concept, because when Google reads somebody's page, it's not a person seeing it visually, and it's not even an AI looking at it visually. Maybe it is at this point, but they're just looking at the contents of the page, which are HTML. And so they can get important information by saying, oh, this is everything in an article tag is an article. But these just give you sort of, for visually speaking, they just give you some default styling, and that can always be overridden or mimicked with a div or a span. So yeah, let's get to the lecture content now. Here's lecture content. I started with what I started with because I thought it was important we got a little more hands-on, but let's see what all of this says. So right, HTML, which we haven't been explicit about yet, means stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's the format that is what a web browser can render and work with. And the purpose of it is that it doesn't matter what operating system you're on or what the specifics of your computer don't matter. As long as you're running a web browser, that web browser can read HTML pages. And that's sort of, web browser becomes the lingua franca, the common language of web pages. And that's important because by the client server model, you can't control what computer that your client is, going to render that resource on. So you have to make sure that it works in a way that is not specific to your client. So we mentioned here that HTML separates content from presentation. That's the HTML CSS divide. CSS would be presentation, what it looks like. HTML just represents the content. It's like the skeleton. And then, yeah, it's the skeleton, and CSS represents like the visual part of it. So let's say it's the body. And then JavaScript is going to represent what gives it life and makes it do things. So I guess JavaScript is the soul in that body, mind, soul analogy, or skeleton, body, soul analogy, mind, whatever. So what else do we have here? Elements define content types by containing tags. We've gone over tags. There are many tags, and you don't need to know most of them. you will learn them with time. They don't do anything. They're just a way of representing your data as a specific thing that is recognized. And so, for example, title would be an example of that. You could have just put this in a div, but putting it in a title or a paragraph or something, putting it in a title says, this is the title of this page, and it's somewhat meaningful. And actually, title will display at the top of the browser in the tab window. So it does have some function. Just going over this, what else? We're going to talk about CSS and I guess how to debug CSS. Okay. So we've gone over what this looks like. Technically, this is what the entire thing should look like. I did neglect to talk about this. Bang doc type. Sometimes we call this symbol bang in programming, but this is what we would call, this is not HTML, rather this is a line that is there to tell whoever is reading this page to expect HTML. So I think this is just, I want to stop clicking that. Because we're sending this over HTTP, this could be anything. It could be doc type markdown or something, and then they would know at the other end, that's what I'm reading. But this is for the browser to know it's HTML, and it has an HTML tag, and then there's an attribute of language we're including, which, you know, it's reasonable. You might want to do that. Then we have some meta tags here, which, as you saw, you can basically leave these out, but they do have meaning. I don't know what all of them mean, but here we're saying we're using a specific character set, basically the English characters. This is going to say, give it a very basic idea of like, just always make the width of the device and then scale it by 1, which that might matter if you're on a very odd screen size. Let's say you're on your phone and you were looking at it sideways. That's how it would determine the width of the screen. And I don't even know what this one is, but it's basically just saying, I guess, more instructions for the browser. If you're on Internet Explorer, actually use Edge. I don't know. And then title we haven't mentioned, but we should mention title because we didn't use it. So if I go back to my page here, you'll notice I have my page, right? But look what it says in the URL browser. It says the actual URL location, which is not ideal. What if I wanted it to say something? Well, that is another thing that goes in the head commonly, which is title. And I would say title is RoboCop fan page. And now if I go back here, you'll notice it, because we're using live server, it automatically reloads. We have our title. So whenever we see a new one of those, we will mention it. What else? We have that link here. That link is just like the link I used over here. A lot of these stuff are not necessary, but we include them because it makes it clear what's happening. And if there was confusion, it would be necessary. But a link means some resource that is not directly in the document. So in this case, it's a style sheet, and that style sheet is at this location. Similarly, you can have a script. We did not go into that yet, but that's how we would add JavaScript if we eventually wanted to. So you could add it in the head also. You don't have to, but I could have a script. And let's look at that again. Script is not self-closing because you could technically put your script inside, but I'm going to write source here, and it's going to be, again, resources, but I'm going to create a new resource called index.js, just to say that's, the basic thing to run. And I'll create a new file in there, index.js, and I'll print hello just to see that I can. And what should happen is that when this web page loads, it immediately runs that code. So we can't see that obviously, but if I look in the console, you'll see we did print something. So we have our we have everything now. We have our HTML, and it can include CSS and JavaScript. It doesn't do anything useful yet, and you might be asking, why is JavaScript useful in this context? And it is not really yet. But we will see eventually how it is, because our HTML is essentially what we're looking at here is our HTML page, right? But you'll notice that every time we hover over one, it actually knows what it's hovering over. And so what we call this, well, we call this the HTML page because this is source code. What the browser renders involves this thing called the DOM, or the document object model. So it's your HTML page turned into an object, essentially. And like an object, things can be nested in each other and have certain properties. And what JavaScript will eventually allow us to do is basically add or remove or alter things in this document object. But for right now, it's not too useful. We're just including them. And P would be paragraph. That's another thing we haven't discussed yet that we might want to, which is the ID and the class. So let's do that now. Why not? What are ID and class? Well, every element can technically have an ID or a class. And ID is a name you're going to give the element that makes it totally unique. So nothing else, I don't think they enforce it, but nothing else should share this name. So we might say something like, this is an H1, but because I have more than one H1, I'll say, I'll give it an ID of title, or maybe even real title. So it's explicit. And then I would give this maybe an ID equal to subtitle. And then maybe I have a bunch of H2s here. Maybe I'm going to have it be like RoboCop's best features. And let's make them all H2s. Why not? Just for display purposes. So what are RoboCop's best features? This is the audience participation part. What are RoboCop's best features?
He's a robot and a cop.
Yeah, he's a robot and a cop. But there, that's not the end of it, because he also has a visor for an eye. Helmet is head. And just because we want to show something for display purposes, well, I guess we already have 3, but is there anything else cool about RoboCop? Yeah, knife thing in hand. I don't know if anyone remembers, he has some kind of spike in his hand for talking to the computer, and he uses it in a terrible way. He's very violent, but for justice. Let's see. So this is what it looks like, right? But why did I create? Oh yeah, there's my ID. So my ID is unique for each one. And then there's also this idea of class, and class means that it's like an ID, but more than one thing can have it. So my class might be Robo feature. And actually, I don't want to give it to the first one, because the first one is like a title almost, right? But I want to give each one of these the Robo feature. Okay, and why did I do all that? Well, it hasn't changed anything yet. It's still the same website, but ID and class are something HTML tends to care about or know about. So if I open up my style document, originally I was writing H1, and that was my selector. My selector was to get everything that was an H1 element and do the same thing to it. But I might say, well, okay, well, all my H1s are red right now, but I can actually override that behavior. So in this case, if I had another H1, maybe I'd want to keep it, but I'd want to say, well, I have an H1, but that H1 has a special property. Well, I mean, you actually don't even have to mention the H1, you just mention that special property, what was that ID again? It was real title or something. Let me check to make sure. Real underscore title, yeah. And actually, this is how you write that. You're saying and you see it shows you up there. It's that hash means an element with an ID of. And so I can give that a specific color. Blue, how about that? And this is a cool thing to notice. So we're just going to do this first. You see how normally our thing was supposed to be an H1, right? But now we're saying anything with the idea of real title has a color of Alice blue. So let's go look at it. Alice blue is too light, so let's make that purple. And we'll look at it. So notice that this is an H1, right? This is an H1, and because we didn't get more specific, it's getting that color and background color that we set over here. So all H1s are going to get this. But because this also has the ID, you'll see it got our H1 CSS stuff. And then because giving something an ID has a higher like significance in CSS, it's going to overwrite anything in the H1 that is conflicting with what is in that ID specific CSS thing. So it's sort of like inheritance in that way. And it's how you can kind of make something more and more specific. But notice that I have the background color in both because that was defined at the H1 level. So CSS selectors allow you to say, I want everything to have this. And then when I want to be specific, I'll give it an ID or a class. So as you see here, we have our class, right? And maybe, this second one here, maybe I do want to be specific. So while they both get the same background color, I'm going to say that, sub title is going to get maybe it won't get a different color, but I'll add stuff to it. I'll say font size large, whatever that means. And maybe font family. Can I get a weird, okay, font weight, bolder. Font family. Ooh, look, I don't even have to think about it. They're going to give me a bunch of fonts I don't even really understand. Let's see what that one looks like. I think the way this works is this means like try this one. If it's not on that computer, back up, back up, back up. And then these are ones the browser knows about automatically. Let's look at it. Cool. So you see it's like in a different font. And now for these three, let's do it with a class. So a class now is represented with dot. And the name of our class was robo feature. So I'm going to say dot robo feature. And now what do we want each one of these to look like? What's something we want to do to each one of these? No right answer here. What do we want to make it look like on our site?
Italicized.
All right, let's italicize them. So how do I do that? Font. This is important. Like when people do CSS, there's so many possible things that you often don't know what you're looking for. So instead you have to, it's very helpful to have one of these autocomplete things, because I could say font and I'm like, oh, font variant, is that what I want? And then I can see on the side there's some different values for font variant. It's a little hard to read, but if I hit tab, okay, what are my font variants? Okay, I don't think that's what I want. How do I do italics without looking it up? It's not font weight, it's not font style. Oh, maybe it's font style. Yeah, there we go, italic. So that's literally how you do CSS for the most part, especially once you're using the developer console. So I'm going to save this right now, and we'll see that robo feature, they're all italicized now, and because they all share the same class. But if I were doing this in the real world, I would click inspect, and I would look here at the style, like, I select the element, one of the elements, and I look at the style tab or whatever. And then I'll see that, this is telling me, well, all H2s look like this by default, but then anything with robo feature also has this. So I can start playing around with that. I could say like, I can right click on that and then, or not right click, just I can get in there and then I start saying something like color. And I just scroll through them. And this is how you do CSS in the real world, which is like, you just kind of figure things out as you go. So I might say like, oh, well, looks a little weird that the features are like right there. What if we, right adjusted this a little? How would I do that? Well, maybe that leads us into our next topic, which is a good one, which is the box model. So you see this box over here? This box represents what all CSS elements look like. It's called the box model. At the very center there, it'll tell you the dimensions of the actual element. 768 by 28 or something. So that's this element right now. And then there's something called padding, and something called border, and something called margin. So to get it out of the way first, we'll talk about border. So how might I do that? I might have a CSS element. No, just trying to. Okay, they're making it hard, so I'm just going to do it in a separate thing. So what am I adding to robo feature? No, I don't like that. I want to get rid of that, but I can't. It's just finicky to click this correctly. Right, so I might say border. And like everything in CSS, there's a specific way you say it. So in this case, I think I say border solid, or actually dotted, that would be cool. Border dotted black. I didn't say, I guess I just chose black automatically. And maybe we want that to be more like 4 pixels. That's pretty cool, right? So that's my border. And you see now the border updated. It says I have a border, the same border on all sides. What's this? So margin represents everything outside of the border. So if I wanted to push, let's say I wanted to push this element away from the one on top of it, I just make that value bigger. And I'm using my the up and down arrows on my keyboard now, which is why developer console is cool. I can just do that, right? Cool. So that might be a way I do that. But then notice margin, I could also say, okay, well, the margin of the left, I want that to go up. So let's start with 1 and let's keep it going up. And that works. And yet I don't want it just for this one element. So what I'll actually do is reload and look here. And notice that when I reloaded, I lost everything because that's part of how, like when you're making these changes in the developer console, it's just to experiment. You don't get to keep it. If you want to keep it, you have to write it somewhere. But right here, I have that robo feature. So let me add to it a margin left of 10 pixels. And you can see it worked, and I can keep going up. So yeah, that's sort of how real world CSS is done. Just to complete that little box model lesson, we have the thing inside, we have the border that kind of represents this boundary. It's invisible right now, but I'll add it in just for seeing purposes. So this is our border, and then notice our margin is outside of the border. It represents how much space our inner element has compared to the elements outside of it. So what is padding? Padding represents the distance between the border and the element inside. So I could say something like what if I wanted to start adding to the top padding? Look at what happens. I mean, it might not be obvious that there's a difference. No, it should be, as in like, we're not pushing away against the top element anymore. We're pushing away against the border. And so by doing this, you can completely control how much space a given element takes up, how much the inner content of that space, like where the inner content is relative to the border, and then where the entire element, including the border, is in relation to what surrounds it. So I kind of went through a lot there because I'm doing this in a slightly odd order, where I'm just introducing a feature as we see it. But we've kind of said a lot. So do we have questions specifically about like CSS or anything else we've talked about since we got back from break? I guess that's a no. But we are open for questions. What haven't we discussed here yet? So we just did, IDs and classes and the box model. You're already familiar with HTML elements in their basic form, their tags, and then they have something, content inside. We've gone over this basic CSS type stuff. Creating a page. Right, something we haven't been explicit about is block versus inline. So block versus inline. When we were here, we were mentioning how if you look at it in this inspector, if I look at that H2, it takes up the whole space. And even if I make it bigger, it still takes up the whole space. That would be called block. If I look at this, we see it only takes up this much space. I could put something right next to it, theoretically. If I make it smaller, nothing happens. It's still taking up that much space, regardless of what happens to the page. So you'll notice that when something is a block, it will try and adjust to the page size, but it will always take up the whole length of the page. So that's why everything else on the page is getting much smaller. But if something is span, it's going to just be the same size always, but not take up the whole page. So the way that one accomplishes that, the basic building blocks of that are div and span. So under this image, I'm going to start writing something. And the first thing I'm going to do is create a div. And I can put things inside of the div. So let me put a span in the div. And in that span, I'm going to write hello world. Hello RoboCop. Okay, so I look back here, right? It says hello RoboCop. It's kind of not a lot of space there, but you'll notice that if I hover over this, look at div. Div on its own is nothing, but because div has something in it, it takes up that whole space. Cool. Within the div, we have a span. This span only takes up its own space. So if I were to start, adding things here, notice that CSS doesn't care about white space. It just cares about these tags. So if I put another span right next to it, I could say goodbye, bad guy from RoboCop, also dad in that 70s show. He was great. Save that. Cool. It's on the same line, right? So we have a span here, and then the next span comes right after. That is good and bad. Basically, we want to use spans and divs together to control what things look like. So if I wanted this on the next line, like let's say I wanted to break at this point, I could say, okay, break, div. So anytime I say div, I'm saying brand new block, I believe, or perhaps it's just fill up the rest of this block. We'll see. I'll put a span in there and I'll just say, hello, I'm getting tired of writing new things. So right, yeah. So what happened? I have my div here, which represents that whole block, including the div under it. Span just represents a line at a time. And then I have a div here, which represents a brand new block and then a span. So spans and divs are just about positioning things as boxes in your 2D space. And your basic two options are drop a whole new block in or just take up new space in an existing block. You'll notice that if you go to the style part of it, you'll see div has a display, like div by default. That's what this means, user agent style sheet. Div by default has a attribute display with a value of block, and span has a, they're not showing it, but span has a similar thing, which is an attribute of display And instead of block, you'll see that that span, I could just say, okay, it is a block now. And you'll see that over here, it's jumping because now it does take up its own line. But by default, it has something called inline. And inline means just take up, as much room as you are. And as you'll see, there's a lot more. There's a lot more, and I've not even encountered most of these. Apparently a lot have to do with tables. Some have to do with list items. But one we will come back to is this thing called flex, because flex gives us even more power in saying how much space something takes up and where it takes up that space. And it was only created, 8 years ago at this point or something, but compared to the other methods that you can lay something out in HTML, flex is now a common way to do that, but that's a future topic. So that is div and span. And as you see, like an H1 by default is a div or a block. An A, which would be a link, is by default inline. So yeah, hopefully that was useful. Do we have any questions about the block span stuff? Or, div span? Just to show you an example, let's go to what's like a safe website? Instagram? I don't even think so. What is a safe, I guess MySpace again. Okay. We can go back to MySpace and you'll notice that if I look in here, I'm going to see a lot of things, and I'm going to see a lot of divs within divs within divs, because that's kind of how you can say what a website looks like. As in, this div has an ID of container. It obviously holds everything else besides, I guess, the footer and other things. So I can look in here, and there's this div called site alert. Something tells me that that's invisible right now. We're not seeing it because, see, it has a display of none. If I took it off, suddenly I'm seeing this red box that they show for warnings. So that's kind of a cool thing you can do now, but you'll notice everything is divs. And then suddenly we have an article, because the article, I guess, represents, a specific thing, the article. And I'm not seeing a display here or anything, but there is some way at this point that it knows to not take up all the space. Its width is 100, which implies it would take up its entire container. Maybe it's this. But yeah, I mean, this is essentially a span, even if I can't tell why it's acting like a span, because it doesn't take up the entire space. And then any div inside of that span would take up all the space of that span. So as you see here, this text part of it, we're using a div to say take up all the space, but all the space relative to the current container. And that's kind of how a website works ultimately. Like, this will be its own section, and sections kind of break, like there's a semantic tag called section, and these things just break down where I can say, okay, here's my section, and then that orange stuff represents some margins, a margin of 20, and then I click in here, and now it has a left and a right margin of 30, so that we're sort of centering it. And then this is a UL, or an unordered list. Again, just semantic, a way of, saying each, we have a list of things, and then this is each list thing. And each list thing, as you see, has a little padding on it. That's the green. And then inside is an article. And this is basically how HTML works. And it has a class of content, which is, determining some CSS on it. And so these ideas all together let you make any website. It's just that a real website tends to get pretty complex pretty fast. So here's an A. A is an anchor tag. It just means it's going to have a URL on it. It's going to link somewhere. So even though we don't think of this image as being a URL, as it turns out, if I click this image, it will go to a different URL. And that's because it's an A tag. And if I look inside of the A tag, I might find an image, but the A tag is sort of, what wraps it. So yeah, you can a lot at this point. I feel like we're at 9:50. I want to make sure we don't give you guys too much lecture time. So I'm gonna speak to Zainab about this, but I would love to just do a little more later. But I think we know enough now that we can just look at the developer consoles for sites and see like, this is all they're using. It might be complex how they're getting things done, but this is ultimately all they're using. Just want to make sure there's nothing that we haven't touched on. So we've touched on CSS. If you wanted to do it in line, you could do it like this, but normally you do a link. We talked about selectors and, you know, this is just doing what I was just doing. We're looking at an Amazon site and seeing how you can alter the CSS. Let's look at that for a second. Yep, exactly right. You can alter the CSS in real time to see what it looks like. And then I suppose there's this idea of CSS specificity. I suppose there is a little equation to tell you what supersedes what in CSS, but for the most part, you are ID is going to be specifically for that one thing. Class is going to be the general way you say this is I want this to grab a specific style. And then the tag itself you only use as a very general measure to say, if I haven't been specific otherwise, all, you know, P tags should have this. The box model, as we mentioned, you have CSS to be specific about the height of the, you know, given the box model, these are all things that it cares about. So how about we do this together before we leave? We'll do as a class this project. And you might see how difficult it is actually, as in I'm going to go here and we're going to say that we have a new thing we're trying to accomplish, right? So one thing we haven't mentioned to you yet is comments in CSS. You do have those as well. This is what they look like. A comment, like in code, is something that is for your eyes only as the source code editor. It's never going to be seen by the user, but it's just a way you can write something. And I'm going to write this. As you see, everything that fits inside of there will be commented out. Okay, so we want to make a square. How might we make a square? Like, let's try and do all of these together because it will show us some stuff, and that's kind of your building block for your building blocks for making anything visual are going to be things like this, right? So let's say we wanted to start adding to our website right here to see things work. In fact, let me put that here and let's put this here as well. Then we'll close that and we'll go to our RoboCop fan page. And we should be able to see things as we change them. So how might I make a square starting here?
Make a div and give it a class of square.
Yeah, pretty good. So we're going to make a new div, which, you know, we don't see anything yet, but if I started typing and I save this, we'll see that, yep, this is a new div starting here. And you said give it a class. Okay. And what is the class?
Square.
Sure, yeah. So we're going to give it a class of square. And I think that's smart because there's no reason a square needs to be an ID. It's not going to be the only square in existence, right? If we want to make a second square, pretty easy. We now just make a new div with class square. Okay, so now that we've given it class square, what's the next step?
Go to the CSS.
Okay.
Dot square. So the next line's dot square. Yep.
Yeah.
And then brackets. And then width is 250 pixels, and then height is 250 pixels. I think it has to be, I'm not mistaken. Oh, maybe that's right. Yeah. think you need commas between, or
Yeah,
sorry,
semicolon.
semicolons. That's right. And then border, this is going to be the 3-pick solid black or whatever.
Okay.
Boom.
Okay, yeah, that should work. So let's save and see what happens. Indeed, it did. So we just created a square, sort of. So first I'm noticing my page isn't scrolling. I wonder why that is. Is it just actually that exactly that big? Yeah, it's just covering it. Okay. Okay, so yeah, here I have my square and we can inspect it. We look down here, we have our square. You'll see it's in a div, so it takes up all that space. And what do we know about our square? Well, we just have this class called square, which defines the width and the height as 250 and the border as black. And that all seems right. It does seem like an actual square. Cool. So how might we make a rectangle? Not too different, but does someone else want to tackle rectangle?
Be the same thing, but you can change the width to like 450 instead of 250.
Yeah, for sure. And let me see. I have so over here, you're saying should I make a brand new class called rectangle?
Yep, since you're keeping the square.
Yeah. Okay, so underneath it, I'm going to make a rectangle. And I guess we're going to make something similar. I can almost see how a square and a rectangle could, we can use like, inheritance type pattern where something is always a rectangle. Then someone can have two classes at once. So we'll see that in a second. But but in this case, I'll just make a rectangle and say the rectangle has what width?
450 or 500.
Yeah, with 500. Height 250, and let's give it a dotted border and make it purple. Why not? Oh wow, what happened there? I put them like one on top of the other. You can do that
You didn't
because
close.
I put it inside. Okay, good
Yeah.
point. Good point. That's interesting that you can do that. Okay, so that's a good point there. That I need to either close the tag like this. If I do that, it'll look like that. But I believe you can just do a self-closing tag. You certainly can do that in React. So if we try that, does it understand it?
No,
It
it's
doesn't
only
seem like-
React.
Okay, it's
with
just a React.
JSX.
Yeah. And now we have our class of rectangle here, and it's below it. And because they're both divs, it should be below it. So there we go. But you see they overlap immediately because we didn't say anything about margins. So, if we wanted to, we could go back to our square and say, well, actually, this has a margin. We're going to say specifically just a bottom margin of, let's just say 6 pixels. We just want to get things below it, a little separate. So there we go. Nice. And let's say I wanted these both to have a background color of red, right? What do you think might be the best way that I get them both to have a background color of red?
You can either make a class called red or just put the same thing on both of them.
Yeah, so basically I have two options. One, I could say background color red, and I'll save and notice that it changed that one, but it didn't change the second because I'm saying, well, it's unique to each. And I could also write it here. And now they both have it. They both have red inside, but this whole idea of classes is, it's not identical to how a class or objects work in a programming language, but it's not totally dissimilar in the sense that I could say, well, actually, I want to have something called red, and this just defines that maybe we're going to call it red inside. And that just adds background color red. Maybe I would call it like dot background red. And this is going to add background red to anything. So I'm going to save. You'll notice there's nothing in there right now because it's not defined in square or rectangle to have this background color red. But because I've made a class called background color red, I can go back here and I could say class is square, sure, but I can actually have more than one class. So class is also red. And now if I save, does it work? Does it not? So I'm looking at this div square red. Why isn't it picking up?
That's not what you named that class.
Oh, background red. Good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Background
BT.
red, background red. So now that works. So you can give it as many classes as you want. And if we look here, it seems to care about the classes in the order you said them. So something tells me that if I now copy this and put it to the front there, it's going to look slightly different. So if I look at my red square, no, it looks like assuming background red first anyways. So I do wonder, maybe it's just always in alphabetical order, but one way or another, we can have more than one class and it just adds them in some kind of order. And so, that's very useful, but also one has to be careful with overwriting things, because if I said my background red had why would I do this? But if I decided that all things with the background red class have a width of 10 pixels, I might get myself into an issue, where these both have 10 pixels now, but it's only because background red is overwriting square. And I would love that to not be the case. And if I bet you if I changed it from being called background red to being called something like Z background red, like there's got to be a logic to the order it does it in. And so, no, it's still overriding it. I'm not actually sure how it decides that one thing overrides.
It's based on the
It's the-
cascading style sheet.
It's
it's
the
based on the
order.
order
Because
of
it
the style
cascades
sheet.
down.
Okay, that makes sense. So right, I can leave it as background color red, which it doesn't matter where I define it there, but seemingly rather which one of these I define first. So let's see if you're right. Yeah, it looks like you are right. In this case, square took precedence over background red because it was defined later. Fair enough. Good point. But right, CSS is going to give you the capacity to, in a programming-like way, it's not quite programming, but it will let you use these selectors. So you only have to be as specific. So you can be as specific or general as you want. Just going back here, I want to see if there's anything we didn't touch on. Oh, right. Yeah, we were in the middle of doing these things. We tried different border values. We could adjust the margin some more. We've done that a little, but if I want to say, well, my square actually, for instance, if I didn't say margin bottom, but I just said margin, let's give it like 10 pixels. You'll notice it actually means it for all directions. So there's a 10 pixel margin all around, not noticeable on the right, but you can notice it on the top, left, and bottom. We tried out some colors. Can you make a circle? This is something to see before we leave, because I don't think we do know enough yet, but let's say we wanted to make a circle. How might we do that?
Border radius.
Oh, come on. How do you guys know things already? That's not fair. Okay, so we're going to make a div and we're going to give it a class equal to circle, right? And what does a circle look like? go here and we'll create a circle, and a circle will be different or similar to our square to begin with. Where, we'll make it a width and a height of 250 pixels, and sure, that's what it looks like. So right now, here's our circle. Our circle is a square. HTML kind of only deals with boxes, right? Like everything on the page has to be a box, or a circle is a box. Well, the way they get around that is something called border radius. Just border dash radius. Okay, so border radius is sort of like saying, what if well, let's see what happens if I gave it like 20 pixels. Okay, as you see, it sort of started to curve that border. So if we hover over it, my border's still, like I'm still dealing with a square as far as the box model is concerned. But now the corners of my border appear to be curved, and I can make that number even bigger. And at a certain point, I don't know exactly how it works, but at a certain point, that radius becomes a circle. So as you see here, it's not quite circle yet, but we keep going up, and before you know it, it looks, it stops because it's a circle now.
You can also do 100%.
What was that?
You can also do 100%.
Okay, and that's a good point, that in CSS, often something can take multiple types of values. So I was giving it an amount of pixels, and it understood that, but it can also take a percentage, and that probably makes a little more sense for border radius, where 100%, I guess, would mean it's definitely a circle, and then like 50% would mean, well, still a circle. This is why it's not always intuitive. But yeah, 20% is not quite a circle. 10% is still basically a square. 0%, as you would expect, is a full square. Okay, so we have a circle now. Pretty cool. Hovering over it, you'll see it's still a box. It just changed the border to look like a circle.
50% puts it into a circle, because you were doing the same thing with pixels, and like 125 pixels would be a circle.
Got it.
Because you're dealing with the 250 pixel boxes.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so if we have our circle, is there anything else to do? We mentioned an oval. Doesn't really matter. It's the same difference. Another cool thing to note, the developer console is so powerful now that if I go to height, let's say, if I go over that number, it's not just saying, oh, you could type a new number. It's giving me a little left-right arrow. It's a little finicky, but I can drag. And you'll see that I can drag that to be an oval. Isn't that cool? Maybe a little easier to see with the width, but I can change it to be an oval just by dragging it. And it makes playing around with CSS and learning how to get the values you want a lot more intuitive than just typing things in. But yeah, that's, I think, everything for right now. We've covered everything that is in the in the curriculum document and what I went over myself. We have an assignment today. Otherwise, though, we technically have 50 more minutes. I just want to start giving you guys more time back, but maybe taking it later in the day. So for right now, let's wrap up in the next 5 minutes and then give you, I guess, until you come back from lunch off. But that being said, the next 5 minutes, ask questions, and also let me know if there's something you want to discuss in more depth in for like 45 minutes later today.
Ben, I don't know if you showed it earlier, but can you just show that? I think it's like HTML bang, that tag that'll do like the plate items.
You're talking about the doc type thing?
No, I thought if you did at the start of your document HTML bang, it would sort of place like a pre-filled in head and body tag items.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, there's kind of two different ideas there. So what you're talking about is that if I'm in Visual Studio Code and I start typing, what is it, doc, or it wants to know it's an HTML page first, so I have something blocking it on my screen. Give me a second. If I were to say it's an HTML page, I think at that point I could start saying doc type. And if I do that, no, okay. There is some way in VS Code to just type a little thing and it gives you,
It's just exclamation mark.
oh, just exclamation mark HTML like that?
No, just the exclamation mark, no opening tag in front of it. Yep,
Okay,
that
cool,
one.
yeah.
Boom.
So apparently that's a VS Code feature. You type in exclamation and then hit tab, and it will autocomplete a basic outline of a valid HTML page for you. You can absolutely do that, and you probably should. Most people don't remember these meta tag things, and it won't matter most of the time. But it's good to have it there. It doesn't hurt at the very least. So yeah, just typing. These are purely Visual Studio things where just that it shows you, oh, that's part of Emmet. Okay, so right, it's just an abbreviation. Emmet is a built-in tool at this point in Visual Studio for anytime you're doing HTML, where it'll do things like autocomplete for you when appropriate. Didn't autocomplete there. I don't, probably because it's not in a valid spot, but it knows a fair amount about HTML, and there's some like high level ways to use it to be very efficient if you want. But I do just want to say that while you do have that thing to autocomplete, this line is not like, if you left it out, it would be okay. It's just there to tell whoever's receiving it what you're about to look at is HTML. And if it's a web browser, it assumes that, so it's pretty okay with you leaving it off. All right. Any other questions around stuff we've looked at today, and or a topic or something we want to hear more about later today?
Later today, could we just go over like some more useful tags and stuff that we're going to encounter and see maybe?
Yeah, we can. I do want to show you that part of the assignment today. Like if we click on the assignment here, part of it is to go to this website and look at like all the tags and pick some you like. But just notice for a second when reading it, there's so many tags and they don't really mean that much, as in, I guess I could go through this list and talk about the ones that will come up the most, but like I've never seen anyone use the address tag. I know exactly when you would want to use that, right? If it's explicitly an address, that makes sense that we'd want to wrap it in an address tag. At the same time, few people do it, and it doesn't really matter. So it's worth pointing out the difference between the purely semantic type of HTML tags and the ones that do something for you. But that's a good point. I'm going to go through this list and figure out which ones are worth talking about. Cool. If that's it, I'll give you the time back until, what time do you guys normally come back? CST?
1:30.
Okay, was that Zainab who just said that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So Zainab, does it make sense? I don't want to eat into any time right now because it's probably too early to get lunch, but when does it make sense to do like a 30 or 45 minute, mini lecture type thing? Or how about you guys? Would you prefer the like after the assignment or before the assignment or in the middle of the assignment?
I'd say before, right when we come back from lunch.
Yeah.
Flesh-eyed, bushy-tailed, and then we can get to the assignment afterwards.
Okay, so Zainab, how does it sound? We break until 1:30 like normal, and then 1:30 to 2, we do like a little mini lecture on the topic of that has been requested.
Can we do 1? Just because it's only 11:15 right now.
Can we do 1?
Yeah, like come back from lunch at 1.
Yeah, as long as the students are okay with that, if that isn't too early, because I'm careful to not eat into lunch, but we can consistently give you guys the same amount of time for lunch. It's just a matter of when people eat, I guess. But if everyone agrees to come back by 1, that works for me. Okay, looks like we're trying it out. So we'll be back at 1 p.m. today.
Okay. And we'll have it recorded. So if anyone can't make it.
Yeah. All right, cool. But now you guys are on break. See you in a bit.
Just one thing I wanted to mention is I added another mini assignment. After you look at the top 10 HTML tags that you play around with, and it's just to